So our next speaker is Dr. Connie Millar from the Forest Service. She's my dear friend and neighbor, and her enthusiastic response to this idea of doing a climate afternoon right before Chautauqua is a big part of why it happened. And she kind of held my hand all along the way, helping with all the development of the program. So Connie has really been a leader in climate change research throughout the country, and we are truly honored to have her as a resident of the Mono Basin and as a speaker today.
Congratulations, Janet, for getting this together. I remember a cold, dark winter night in Mono City when she was dreaming up this idea, and look, here you are, you made it happen. And also to your gang for the Climate Action Group, really it's a model, and I'm really proud of what's happened. So Janet asked me today, proposed that I talk a little bit more at a general overview of climate responses, and I'm happy to do that. And really what this will be sort of a summary of the lessons that I've learned in the 25 plus years that I've been working in this region and looking at climate responses. And before I get into that, I would just say that some of you may have seen pieces of this, but I hope that as I add more and more lessons as I work in this area, that the bigger picture will continue to be of interest as we kind of put the stories together. So you know it takes a community to raise a scientist, and I would want to acknowledge my collaborator, Bob Westfall, who has, raised your hand, Bob, who has been very important all these years. He's really the quantitative brains behind what we do. And many others of you, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your experiences here, so that I could come of age as a scientist. I'm afraid it's a senior age now, but still going. So what I want to start with before some of the stories from the Western Great Basin is just, since this is a general talk, we're going to start at the very ground level. And I think it helps always to be on the same page with some of these bigger picture issues. So first of all, I think it seems so fundamental, right? What's the difference between climate and weather? But I think there's a lot of confusion about that. There'll be perhaps a very cold, snowy winter, and there'll be some public who might think, well, there isn't any global warming, right? We see it was a cold winter. So what are the differences? Well, really, climate is the average pattern of weather for an area. It's what we expect to have. So we expect these nice, warm Mediterranean summers where you can have your shorts and t-shirts and be up on top of mountains. And that's based on, well, you know, it's a Mediterranean climate. We get warm, dry summers. We get wet, snow-laden winters, we hope, coming from the Pacific. But occasionally we don't, and we'll get very vagaries of weather where, in fact, the weathermen perhaps, or weatherwomen predicted nice days, and in fact we get rain for 2 weeks. So that's what weather is. Weather is more what we get. Climate is what we expect, and climate is based on the average pattern, so it's an average. So that begs the question, when you have an average, you have a denominator, right? So how many years do you think it takes to make a climate? 50. 50 is the one answer. 500. Other ideas? 20. Well, basically they're all right. So the standard meteorological convention is to have 30 years as a climate normal. So you go 30 years, you get those averages, and those are what are considered the current climate. And then it changes, and so you get new normals and new averages, and on we go. But you're absolutely right. It's very arbitrary. And people like Greg Stock and myself, who are paleoscientists, who are interested in the past, maybe we average over times that are more like centuries or millennia. And that's a climate also. So I just want to remind you to be sure and keep in mind, when we're thinking about climate, people might talk about it in these different average periods. So some more overview, starting from the global level, just again, so we're on the same page. These are facts. The Earth is warming. This is 20th century, showing 20th century temperatures. The more red you get, the warmer conditions are. Basically, over the 20th century, everywhere on Earth has been warming. The deeper the oranges and reds, the warmer it is. There are exceptions, right? But on the whole, Earth, take the pulse of temperature and the Earth is warming. Looking at the changes in the hydrologic cycle, precipitation, snow and rain, it's highly variable, much more variable than a warming temperature. So some places, again, bluer is wetter, browner is drier, much more variable across the globe. Consequences, facts. Consequences are pervasive. There are all kinds of different changes happening that have been well documented, well attributed, but both physical, snow levels, snow and ice, sea levels, effects on species and ecosystems, and impacts to humans in both goods and services, and health and livelihood. So moving down from, one more thing. Another fact is that we know that increasingly the causes for the changes in climate from here into the future are being dominated by us, by processes that humans are mediating. And it's important again to understand, and these last few slides I should mention come from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is now their 5th assessment report. This is a consensus of the world's best climate scientists, and they put out these reports periodically. So those last slides all come from their consensus. It's important to kind of understand that there isn't just one thing driving climate change. Often we think greenhouse gases, increases in carbon dioxide and in methane, but there are a whole bunch of different things that are going on at the same time. Kind of like an orchestra. A symphony is made up of many parts, but you get music coming out. So there's these different forces. The greenhouse gases make things warmer. Some other processes make things cooler. And there are, by the way, these natural processes still happening that were dominant before the 20th century. So you sum these all up, and that's how you get these inferences about changing climates. Now that was looking forward, and what we wanted, or that was more at present, what we want to do now is look a little bit more in our region. And thank you, Jeff, for introducing concepts of downscaling. So we start with these global models, and we're able to say something about local regions, because of course it's different than the global average. We need to take into account topography and the dominance of the Pacific and such. So there are many ways to scale down the models that we take from the global level. And I've chosen our own Maureen McGlinchey. She works with your climate action group. She lives in Mono City. She did her master's work with the prominent bioclimatologist Ron Nielsen at OSU. And some years she was working on modeling climate projections in Western North America. But some years ago we were working with the Inyo National Forest, and she carved out these pieces for the Inyo. So if you can look at these maps, this is the Inyo National Forest. The black outlines, there's Mono Lake up at the top in each of these. And what she's done is she's taken 3 different climate models. We try to look at a lot of models so we can see the differences between them. And see these are 3 climate models here. And these are 3 different emission scenarios that, depending on what humans do in the future, will depend on what the future projections are. So the top panels show an increase in minimum. Those are night temperatures that are likely across our region. So you see some variation in the different model types, in the different emission scenarios, but all warming. And in maximum temperatures, those would be the daytime temperatures. They seem to be warming even more. And I won't belabor the actual details. I think the point is that we're warming just like the globe is warming, perhaps even more in the Mono Lake area. And once again, the changes in precipitation are more variable. They're much harder to project, and they are definitely different depending on the different models that we have. So that's much harder to project, and so that makes a problem for Jeff and his colleagues to try to interpret the future, because the uncertainties are greater with the hydrologic regime. Now that was looking to the present and looking forward, and I want to take 2 slides to just put you in context. Sometimes I think, again, being a historical scientist, I think in backwards time as well as forward. But I think there are a lot of times where we get so caught up in the details that we think climate has just started changing in the 20th century. And I just want to put you in a relative perspective of the relevant past. So this little graph I just ginned up myself, and it's taken from a number of papers, many more that are referenced in these, that attempt to show in the Western Great Basin, our region, relative temperature differences from the middle 20th century, going back 18,000 years in time. Just so you can kind of see how things were back to the last biggest ice age. So let's just work quickly through here. We can see these are maybe plus or minus 1 or 2 degrees, but the relative positions here. Temperatures were warming. At this point, there were glaciers filling all our canyons, Lundy and Vining and Virginia. And the temperatures started warming. As they were on the way out of that, the glaciers receded up toward the cirques. And then there was what we call a climate reversal, which is where circulation patterns, solar insolation patterns changed, such as conditions got cold again. And there was another major ice advance. And that's the biggest ice advance that we know in the last 15,000 years. It's called the recess peak glaciation. And then we started to get, the Earth started to get, Western Great Basin started to get warmer. And in fact, there were several more climate reversals in this period. But I'm not showing them because we don't have good information on how they affected this part of the world. Geologists call this boundary around 10,000 years ago a transition between the Pleistocene and our current Holocene. Conditions continued to get warm in our region. This blue and yellow is showing wet and dry periods, again, relative to the present. And this, for about 4,000 years, we had very warm, hot conditions. And you can see, again, the relative differences here. And that had big effects on physical resources, hydrological resources, ecological resources in our area. After about 4,000 years, the temperatures were cooling. We started to go into what's been now being called the neoglacial. So all of these big glaciers here had melted by then. There were no more glaciers in our mountains. They started to regrow around in here, and Greg will be talking about those in his talk and some of the effects of current warming. So even though there was this neoglacial, it was interrupted by 2 dry periods. One was an 800-year-long period called the late Holocene dry period. It affected lake levels, it affected ecology in this area. It was rather cool though. Then another little cool snap into what is the medieval period, where you probably heard of the Scottstein stumps. Lake level was low, the West Walker was dry, trees were growing down in those areas. It was a hot and dry period here for about 400 years. Then we went into about 400 years of a little ice age. And it was very cold. And glaciers grew the largest, ice glaciers grew the largest since they have been 15,000 years ago. And we only came out of that period around the early 20th century. So again, I want to just have you have the sense of the bigger picture. And some folks might say, well, this is irrelevant, it's 18,000 years. But it really is only a wink in time of most of our biota. So the pines and the conifers that I work with, they evolved in their current form and their current ecologies 30 million years ago. So this is definitely a relevant time to them. And again, just one quick snap to say even bigger picture, just so that you know if that was a lot of variability, there's even a lot more before. So look at this now. The paleoclimatologists think in backwards terms. So this is the present here, and this is backwards in time, rather than the slide I showed was going the other way. So here we are at the present. This is temperature. This is 2.8 million years ago. Here's the Pleistocene, here's the Holocene, or here's the Holocene right there. So this slide that I just showed you, that period point right there is this 2 here. And here we are at present. So you can see this is not error or noise. This is actual climate variability over the course of the Pleistocene. So the good news from this is that our biota have been exposed to considerable climate change in the past. The good news as managers is we can understand how they've done that and try to mimic some of those natural processes. Okay, well, how do we expect mountain species to respond as temperature increases? What do you think?
Go higher into the mountains.
Move up, what else? That's good. Die, did I hear? Die, yeah. That's another, any other? Move north, move around, yeah. Adapt, thank you, okay. They can move uphill, they can adapt genetically in place, or they can die, or we say populations extirpate. And yes, they're going, whoever said some other things, thank you, because that's a lead into the rest. These are the general expectations. You'll see these over and over again in papers. These are what projections are based on for future ecologies, what the National Forest, BLM, Park Services uses. Why do we expect species to move uphill? It's cooler uphill. We just know that from our experience, right? Going from Bishop to White Mountain Peak, it's a lot cooler. And that is because of an average atmospheric law whereby molecules are denser near the Earth, they're less dense, there's less pressure higher up. In a column of air, there's a regular rule about how much change there is for how many meters of elevation. So yes, as things get cooler, if it gets too hot, then species will move uphill. And in fact, we have lots of evidence from that, from going from that last glacial maximum to the present. Limber pine, which I work with, is subalpine species, bristlecone pine. They had been, during that last glacial maximum 18,000 years ago, on the piedmonts of our Great Basin ranges. And now they're the tree-line species. So they've moved about 1,000 meters. So yes, but over a very long time. And these are what the basis for these expectations, these projections about the fate of our mountain species in the future by the end of the 21st century. So we started to see these in 2004. Marine has also produced some that are projections that are similar. Global warming, basically the story would be, threatens our systems because of the going to heaven effect, which is as they move up, they find no more space to move and they go off the tops of the mountains and extirpate. So that is has been the big concern based on projections. And some of these showing that our higher elevation communities, the alpine ecosystem, the subalpine forests, may be lost as much as 95% in our region. Now, that's the expectation. And just like climate and weather, there are other possibilities. And the work that I've been doing with my colleagues for the last 25 and plus years brings forward a number of stories. And bear with me, because what follows now is more litany of some of those stories that are other than these expectations. And the point will be that really it depends on what species you're working on, what system, what area, what spatial context, what temporal context. Things will depend, will vary, especially if we're talking about the next 100 years. So mountains have complex environments, right? We know that. They're complex in their geomorphology. They may be a fault block range with a steep escarpment like the Sierra on one side, gradual on the other. They might be more of these volcanic cones. They have complex topography, valleys and slopes. They have different soils, metamorphics, volcanics, granitics. And they develop complex climates. This is probably the most important point. And these are based on different spatial scales. So the big picture climate for a region, when we look at a satellite picture, that's really the macro climate. It's what depends on global circulation. It's what we call the synoptic meteorology. But there are a lot of other climate processes going on at smaller spatial scales. Mesoclimates are those which occur between landforms, so between, say, the Sierra and the Mono Basin. So they're different because of the fact of the mountains there are the basins next to them. If you move into a mountain range, for instance, there are a lot of different climate processes that occur because of the topography. We call that topoclimates. So these could be different solar radiation that occurs because of south and west and north slopes. They could be because of different lapse effects. So this situation where I was saying it's cooler high can be completely reversed, right? We know that living in the Mono Basin. We often get these inversions where it's much colder at lower elevations. These set up regularly in certain places and can have dramatic effect on the plants and animals that live in those areas. And finally, at the smallest scale, we speak of microclimates, which are at least can be partially or even wholly disconnected from the bigger level climate. And again, if you're a shrew or a meadowvole or pika, and you live in that all your life, and your generations hence do, that absolutely matters. So we really need to recognize the idiosyncrasies of place and of species. So that is why I tend to think that mountain biota respond complexly, they respond individualistically, and that uphill migration isn't the only response. So think about that if you have a species of special interest in a location of special interest. And so here comes my long litany, and it gets longer the more work that I do. I'm hoping the end is to put it together in a big framework. So we'll start with some examples where there doesn't seem to be any shift in elevation, even though there has been warming climates. And some of you may know that we work with a project that's an international alpine plant monitoring project. We have plots in target regions in the White Mountains, and several in the Sierra, the Panamint Range, the Carson Range, Great Basin National Park. And over the last 10 years, we've seen about a degree Celsius warming at these mountain summit sites. But we see no change. There's a very standard protocol for measuring plants. We haven't seen any change in vegetation diversity on these sites. Other places have. But I think the arid climate, the long-lived plants, they just don't respond very fast. So there's one kind of response with no shift in elevation. Is it basically not much change? Can have no shift in elevation, but an increase in forest density. And I would say that if you're interested in some of the papers and the more fundamental data that underlie what I'm saying, the papers are on my staff webpage. I'll give you the URL at the end here. And some other work that other folks have done. So this is pervasive in the subalpine zone where I work, most of the upper elevation. And we know that it's probably not related to disturbance because fires, and until fairly recently, insect effects have been minor. That's why people who are interested in climate like to study the high elevations, because the climate signal is pretty pure. So we've seen this densification, repeat photos of the vales. This is from, anybody guess where that is? I'm sure you know some, that location might be familiar. Gaylor Lake, good job. Gaylor Peak, looking across to the edge of Mount Dana. So yes, densification. As we came out of a little ice age, it was warming but still quite wet. It's a natural response, not a fire suppression effect here. And Chris DeLonge has also looked at comparing different diameters. This was an early 1900s surveys in the subalpine zone, and the modern. Many more small diameter young trees now, many fewer old growth trees. So in fact, there's just been this filling in with no shift in the elevation zones of the species that they're looking at. We're also finding this throughout the Great Basin in other species, limber pine, bristlecone pine, whitebark pine. This densification is very common, but it seems to come in episodes. So it isn't just over the whole 20th century as temperatures have been warming, and I'll get to that a little later. We can also have no shift in elevation, but specific kinds of landforms are densifying. So one kind, which isn't immediately obvious, but once your eye gets tuned into it, it's quite apparent. And that is areas in the upper subalpine forest that during the Little Ice Age had been persistent snow packs. They're mostly north slopes. And like glaciers, they're melting more during the growing season and allowing recruitment by conifers into those snow patches. And so whereas they had held off any growth into these areas, here's one that hasn't really been filled in yet, the trees are recruiting into these and basically filling in that whole zone. It's kind of interesting. Take a look when you next go on some hikes. And the last place for them to fill in is the center, because that's where the longest, most persistent lens of ice usually is. And they were also responding to warming over the 20th century, so it's been kind of a gradual infilling. But no shift in elevation here. And another specific landform that's densifying without any shift in elevation are conversion of meadows to forests. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with controversies over this. Is it historic, or is it ongoing grazing? Is it land use of some kind, fire suppression? Our studies suggest that it's primarily climate related, because we've looked at many different meadow types with different meadow histories, grazing histories, fire histories, and they all respond in the same way, and they respond to a major period in the mid-20th century. There's another pulse beginning now, which was a particular time when conditions had, for a long period of time, there were warmer temperatures, water tables lowered, colder drainage was less, and there was very stable conditions from year to year. So trees that got established could stay. There's a seed rain onto these meadows all the time, and even seedlings will germinate, but if there aren't the conditions that persist, they don't persist. They will also die. So here's another one, again with no shift in elevation. Some species are very plastic, and they can just change their form as the conditions change around them. Whitebark pine, our common tree-line species in the Sierra, is a sublimely plastic species. It doesn't seem to be moving up above its tree line, or its species line, But it does change form over that whole elevational gradient. From upright trees, this is near Mount Dunderberg, and then as conditions get worse, the tops might be more resisted, and the trees that come up start to be shaggier. They have these skirts, we call them, that are protected under snow, maybe some flags sticking up. And at the highest levels, the desiccating winds and the severe conditions keep them at just a shrub size. And we call that shrub kind Krummholz, which is from the German embattled wood. And these are not genetically different forms. These individual trees can more or less transfer back and forth, just responding to the transient conditions as they go. And other species aren't as able to do that. So these transitions from upright through the sort of shaggy flag and skirt to the more abrupt Krummholz, they take the specific combinations of wind and precip and temperature, and again, using tree ring approaches, which Kaylin thankfully gave a little introduction to, we're able to date the development of these, we call them flags that stick up, and then also sometimes they die and you could date those as well. So again, there was this period in the middle 20th century when there was a lot of upgrowth, of conversion from the Krummholz to more of this upright type. And that was related to this period, longer term period of more stable conditions that allowed that to happen. Another thing that you might have seen in recent years, especially during our drought, is that when there is diminished winter snow cover, there is another effect on crown form, and it can be so severe that it can cause death. And that is where there isn't these trees, and especially non-deciduous shrubs, rely on a winter snow cover to protect them from the sub-freezing winds or temperatures and freezing winds. When there is no snow cover, they will either die, many of these shrubs, or they'll be pruned back if they're trees. Some of them will resprout, maybe you've seen this in places, and a lot of this, the graniculea has just died. So that's another effect. Another effect of no shift in elevation are that the trees die in places. And here it's more disturbance effect. You certainly know about the bark beetles affecting the recent drought, the whitebark pine. There was an earlier drought in the late 20th century that affected primarily limber pine, which is another subalpine species. And these were in quite limited, localized area that had nothing to do with changing elevation. We realized that a combination of drought, multi-year drought, which is not uncommon in the West. We see that pulsing back through the past centuries. But what is unusual in these recent centuries, as you saw from my historic graph, is that increasing warmth. So warmth with drought is perfect conditions for, and increasing density, perfect conditions for bark beetles. So we got these bark beetle outbreaks on our two high elevation species, but it's not, it may look bad, it may look copper and then dead, but there's some adaptive outcomes of that. These are native insects. They have inerrant endogenous processes that they actually, the epidemics go down. Not all the trees are killed, so you see these green trees. And what this effect is that stands are thinned from something more like this to a more sparse condition, which is less likely to be susceptible to bark beetles in the future. And the trees that are surviving, have been able to, are genetically adapted to more warmer conditions than those that died in the bark beetle attack. And interestingly, they're quite limited in our area. We're lucky. They're not landscape-wide epidemics. They've been maintained an endemic nature. So these have been in localized areas, but they're all rather similar contexts. They've been on north slopes. They've been mostly low elevation for the species range, far out on the escarpment, little drainage from slopes above, and so they have high evaporative stresses. Another situation where trees die without an obvious shift in elevation, either upper or lower tree lines, are where the new, seems to be a new pattern of wildfires coming into the subalpine zone. This is an area that we're taking on as some new studies, considering the possibility of fire being, having a role as an architect in the future subalpine zone, which, as I said earlier, it hasn't been a major landscape player. So for instance, the Walker Fire, their Bowler Gibbs Canyon that happened last summer, it started in the woodlands, the Pinion woodlands. Now the woodlands are more dense, heavier fuels, more continuous into the highlands. They carry the fire right up into, this is all whitebark pine here, Gibbs Canyon over here, Mount Gibbs, into the highlands, right up through into the Crumhole Zone, as far up as the species goes. The Round Fire, we all know about that, down at Swell Meadows, 40 homes destroyed in a few hours last winter. So the idea of off-season fires, that was the main concern, of course, the Swell Meadows area. But that fire also ran up Wheeler Crest into the subalpine and alpine zone. So that's something that we'd like to start looking at. Our colleagues around the world are seeing actually an effect on tree line on the high upper elevation, but we haven't seen that yet here. One more note, no shift in elevation. And I don't know if this one's related to anthropogenic climate change, probably not, but I think it's still important to consider because we've seen more of these events in more recent years. You might know the Devil's Windstorm that happened around Thanksgiving in 2011. It had a massive effect on downfall in the Middle Fork of the San Joaquin, but also here up in this is in the Saddleback Lake area, on the high elevations of alpine forests. These were remarkable wind events with sustained winds for a very long time, giant gusts. So when those set up, if they're more common, there's certainly going to be an architect on our forest. And then one more. I think someone mentioned this earlier when we were asking about what do species do. Well, they can move around aspects as well. Don't have to go up or down to find cooler or warmer conditions. They can move around slopes. And we've been looking at limber pine, which is, again, the treeland subalpine forest species of the Great Basin. And this story comes from the Wasik Range, which is the mountain range about an hour west of here near Hawthorne, above Walker Lake. And on those slopes, if you walk around those slopes, you'll find dead wood on all aspects. And because this is a very arid region, and there's no fire so far up there, that wood just sits there for millennia. And using tree ring methods that Caleb discussed, we're able to date those because they're so well preserved. The current condition of the live slopes, live trees, is only on the north slopes. So they're very sparse, scattered limber pines on the north slopes. There's dead wood in here too, but everywhere else there's a lot of dead wood. So we date those, and using these tree ring methods, what each line here is a different either a live tree, if it's coming to the present, or it's a dead piece of wood that died. Its birth date is on the inside and its death date is on the outside. And so if you look at all of the trees that we've dated, the live trees, the dead wood, you see that over 3,500 years from present back, there's been trees in the Wasik continuously. But if we look at them by aspect, we can see that there have been extirpations on certain aspects, there have been recolonizations, and only on the north slopes have there been continuous distributions. The periods where there's been extirpations on certain aspects have correlated with these periods that I mentioned earlier of persistent long-term drought. So when there are those droughts, recruitment halts, and so that sets up a gap, and in some cases there's another drought that happens, and then that leads to extirpation on those slopes that have not been recolonized. Here's starting some examples of where species are shifting. So I don't mean to deny that doesn't happen. There are shifts in elevation up. My favorite example is work that we've done in the Western Great Basin ranges. But limber pine, unlike whitebark pine, it is moving upslope. It is going up above its tree line. And where it grows with bristlecone pine, as in the White Mountains, it's going above 300 meters above the bristlecone tree line. And in fact, we've considered bristlecone to be the higher elevation species, but now it's leapfrogging above. And whether bristlecone catches up or not, well, we'll have to come back in 50 years and see. This is happening in an episodic manner. It's not gradual. This pulse of regeneration, here's White Mountain Peak, happened during that period, 1965 to 2000, and we don't see a lot of regeneration after that. But it probably will happen again. Another example of that, of shift in elevation, this is more of an historic example, is where species diversity has increased. This is a study from White Wing Mountain and San Joaquin Ridge. You probably know both these places, going over Minaret Summit. White Wing Mountain is just south of June Lake, but north of Mammoth Mountain. That's Glass Creek Meadows there. And on this summit, which is above local tree line now, there are all these big logs lying there, and also on San Joaquin Ridge. And you can see straight stemmed trees. If you do the tree ring work, they were growing very fast. The closest live trees now are sort of Krumholtz, white bark pine, lower down. So we did the tree ring work there to get the ages of those deadwood, and we find that they are primarily or exclusively in the medieval climate period. So between 800 and 1350, Common Era, we call that. Here are the live trees that are coming in on the edges of the ridge. And interestingly, we had our colleague who is a wood anatomist look at the different identifications of that dead wood, and we find that there were 6 different conifer species. This is about 10,000 feet at the summits here. It was a forest during that medieval period. There was white bark, western white, you can read them. The black text here indicates the closest elevation to the summit at present. So for instance, western white pine, the closest occurrence is 300 meters below at present. But they were all growing up there on White Wing Mountain and San Joaquin Ridge. The most interesting one to us is the sugar pine, which, as you likely know, does not grow east of the Sierra Crust at present. It's a mid-montane species of the mixed conifer zone on the west slope. But there it was on White Wing Mountain, growing tall and straight with many rings, with a few rings to the inch. It was a very happy place for those species at that time. It was, as you remember, the medieval period, and it was warmer and drier. We did sort of a back-of-the-envelope approach to modeling the differences between the climate at the time and the present. And we figured that it was drier, probably summer rain though, in order for the sugar pines and hemlocks to grow there, but it was warmer. And this picture is somewhat what we're looking at for the end of the 21st century. So if you want a bit of a picture of what conditions might be, go up on White Wing Mountain and reconstruct the forest in your mind there. So one more example of shifting in elevation, species going up, but they're also going down. And the very same species that are going